July 11, 1952, Pyongyang, North Korea. It was a humid night, thick with the smell of rain and smoke. The Taedong River ran black under the faint glow of an oil lamp from a fisherman's shack, the last light before the city vanished. Somewhere in the distance, a child coughed, and her mother hushed her quickly, pressing a hand over the small mouth. The sky was silent then. Too silent, and every silence in wartime carried the weight of what would follow. At 9:40 p.m., the air raid sirens began to wail for the people of Pyongyang. Sirens were no longer warnings. They were rituals of survival. Mothers gathered blankets, fathers reached for shovels, and children clutched the wooden rosaries given out by Red Cross nurses months before. They moved toward the dugout's shallow tunnels dug beneath the ruins of older bombings, their walls slick with moisture, the earth trembling faintly beneath their feet. Above them, 48 B-29 superfortresses from the United States Air Force were already approaching from Okinawa and South Korea, their engines rumbling across the Yellow Sea. The operation had a cold precision: Pyongyang, once the heart of Korean independence movements, was now marked for erasure. Each bomber carried up to 10 tons of ordnance 500-pound general-purpose bombs, 1,000-pound high-explosive blocks, and clusters of 260-pound napalm canisters. The target grid was divided into 12 sectors. The command, relayed through the 19th Bombardment Group, was clear erase resistance centers. Maximum coverage, no secondary passes required. In the tunnels, Kim Myong-suk, a nurse barely 22 years old, tried to keep her hands from shaking as she packed bandages and morphine ampules into a tin box. Around her, 30 civilians huddled close: an old tailor with a broken leg, 3 orphans who hadn't spoken since their mother was killed the week before, and a young man who still wore the remnants of his railway uniform. Then came the first sound, not a whistle, but a tearing in the air. The bombs fell in waves. The first detonation lifted the ground like a living thing. The second collapsed the western tram depot. By the fifth, the sky itself seemed to burn. Every explosion bled into the next until the city's shape dissolved homes, bridges, schools, hospitals, all swallowed by a storm of fire and steel. Eyewitnesses later said the bombing lasted 47 minutes. To those inside, it felt endless. Each time the earth paused, they thought it was over. Then came another roar, another shockwave that crushed the air from their lungs above the inferno. The pilots saw nothing but a sheet of flame, a city unmade by geometry and firepower. It looked like daylight, one navigator recalled. You couldn't tell where the bombs ended and the fires began. Below, Kim Myong-suk clawed at the dirt, trying to reach the surface. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dust and gasoline fumes. Somewhere close, someone was screaming, a child, perhaps, but the sound was already muffled by the rumble of collapsing concrete. She pressed her hand against her chest, felt her heartbeat racing, then slowing. Around her, the tunnel walls cracked like brittle bone. When she finally pushed through the surface, the world had turned red. The hospital where she had worked 2 days earlier was gone. Nothing left but a blackened signpost and a crater large enough to swallow a bus. The streets were rivers of ash. Bodies lay twisted in the open, burned beyond recognition. The Taedong River glowed faintly from the reflection of the fires consuming both banks. She stumbled forward, one hand shielding her face from the heat, the other clutching her tin box of morphine, the only thing left that still made sense. Somewhere near Moranbong Hill, the remains of a school burned quietly. Desks and textbooks melted into pools of ink and plastic. A child's shoe floated in a puddle of oil. By dawn, 90% of Pyongyang was gone. The official reports from the 19th Bombardment Group listed complete target saturation achieved. The mission logs noted minimal resistance, favorable weather, and no aircraft losses. The photographs taken from reconnaissance planes the next morning were clinical, a mosaic of ash-gray patterns where streets used to be, the Taedong River cutting through like a scar. For those on the ground, there were no words, no categories, only the endless, smoldering silence of a city that had stopped breathing. When morning came, Pyongyang no longer resembled a city. From above, reconnaissance planes described it as a lunar landscape. From the ground, it was something far worse, a graveyard still burning. Kim Yong-suk moved through the ruins as if in a trance. The air shimmered with heat. The metallic stench of blood clung to everything, seeping into the dust, coating her lips with a taste she would never forget. The sky had turned the color of brass, dim and heavy, and even the river seemed to boil, all around her. People wandered aimlessly through what had once been neighborhoods. Some carried pots of rice gone cold, others clutched family photographs, edges singed by fire. One man held the severed arm of a woman not in grief, but disbelief, as though trying to return it to its owner. By noon, the fires had spread into the hills. The wind carried sparks across the river, igniting what remained of wooden homes and storehouses on the eastern bank. Pyongyang's hospitals already hit in previous raids were gone. The wounded now lay in the open, wrapped in torn sheets, their faces coated in soot and oil. A few surviving medics gathered near the ruins of the Pyongyang railway station, improvising a triage zone beneath the charred remains of a bridge. There were no supplies, no bandages, no plasma, no anesthetic. Kim opened her tin box, 6 ampules of morphine. That was all. A man was brought to her. His body burned from the waist up. His uniform still bore the insignia of the Korean People's Army, though his face was unrecognizable. Save him. Someone said. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask his name. She injected him quietly, whispering something she herself couldn't understand, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just the echo of human habit in a place where humanity had collapsed. In the afternoon, Eat S. Aircraft returned not for bombing, but for reconnaissance. 2 F-80 shooting stars swept low over the smoldering city, their silver wings flashing in the sun. Survivors instinctively ducked, pressing themselves into the ash. The planes didn't fire, but their presence alone was enough to send people running again, desperate, directionless, into the smoke. In Washington, the bombing campaign was classified as strategic interdiction. Between 1950 and 1953, more than 635,000 tons of bombs would fall on North Korea, more than 3 times the total dropped in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. Nearly every city north of the 38th parallel would be destroyed. Pyongyang, the capital, was the showcase of this devastation, a message written in fire. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Command, later said bluntly, "We burned down every town in North Korea. We killed off what 20% of the population we went over there and fought, and eventually burned down every town in North Korea anyway." In the ruins of the Taedong River Valley, that statement was not a matter of politics. It was a fact carved into bone and ash. By dusk, the survivors began to gather in small groups. They built fires using broken doors and furniture. They shared boiled river water, bitter with soot. Someone played a half-broken accordion, the sound thin and ghostly, swallowed by the empty spaces where walls used to stand. Kim sat among them, her face streaked with ash, watching the light fade over the ruins. Around her, No one spoke of rebuilding. There was nothing to rebuild from. When the night fell again, the city was silent, not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. The fires still glowed beneath the rubble, casting a dull orange reflection on the river. The moon rose, faint and colorless, over a place that no longer existed. Somewhere far to the south, in the safety of briefing rooms, the mission was considered a success. Targets neutralized, resistance eliminated, the psychological objective complete. But in Pyongyang, people still dug with their bare hands, searching for what remained of their families under the cracked foundation of what had once been a school. Kim heard a sound, faint, rhythmic, human. She clawed through the dirt until her nails bled. When she reached the source, she found a child, a boy, no older than 6, covered in ash, but still breathing. She pulled him close, wrapping him in her jacket. He opened his eyes briefly, too weak to cry. His first word was not mother, not help. It was simply water. Kim looked toward the river, that black, poisoned mirror of what once gave life to the city, and whispered, "I'll find some." She stood, her shadow stretching long across the ruins, and began walking toward the river's edge. The Taedong River was no longer water. It was a slow, dark current of oil, ash, and floating debris. Burned rafters drifted beside bodies swollen from the heat. The stench of gasoline mingled with something far older, the sweet, metallic rot of death. Kim knelt at the edge, cupping her hands. The surface shimmered, reflecting the distant glow of the city's fires. She hesitated. The boy in her arms stirred weakly, murmuring again for water. She gave him a few drops, knowing it might kill him, and knowing there was no other choice. Around her, survivors moved silently along the riverbank. A woman washed the soot from a baby's face with trembling hands. 2 soldiers built a raft from broken beams, trying to ferry the wounded to the northern side, where rumors said an aid post still stood. Each movement was mechanical, drained of thought, the choreography of people who had already accepted the end. The bridge across the river had collapsed, its steel frame twisted like molten wire. Beneath it, the air was still hot enough to blister skin. From somewhere upriver came a distant cry, then another, then silence. The sound was swallowed by the crackle of fires still burning beneath the ruins. As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. The survivors huddled together for warmth, their bodies covered in soot and blisters. Someone began reciting a prayer, voice shaking. Others joined, not in faith, but in habit. Above them, the sky was streaked with faint trails of smoke, the remnants of flares dropped by American reconnaissance aircraft hours before. They hung there like dying stars, slowly fading, one by one. Kim held the boy closer. His breathing had grown shallow. She could feel his heartbeat fluttering against her palm like a trapped bird. She whispered to him softly nonsense words, fragments of lullabies, anything to keep him awake. But his eyes were already half closed. By dawn, he was gone. She didn't cry. There were no tears left in Pyongyang. She laid the boy beside the river, wrapped in her blood-stained jacket, and covered him with pieces of burned paper that had once been the pages of a school book. Then she stood and looked back toward the city. Smoke still rose in thin, steady lines from what had once been the central district, the government buildings, the tram lines, the theater, the hospital. Nothing recognizable remained. The few survivors who could still walk began to leave the riverbank, heading north toward the hills. The roads were impassable, choked with rubble and corpses. Yet they walked, women in scorched dresses, children barefoot and silent. old men dragging their feet through the ash. The American bombers did not return that day. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. It wasn't peace. It was the emptiness left behind when a city's heartbeat stops. In Washington, reports describe total neutralization of Pyongyang as an urban and industrial center. Intelligence estimates placed the city's destruction at over 90%, 3,000 tons of bombs dropped in a single operation. Strategic briefings spoke of psychological shock value and disruption of enemy morale. But in the hills above the Taedong, Kim and the others dug shallow graves with their hands. There were no coffins, no markers, just stones placed over earth that steamed faintly from the heat below. As the days passed, the smell of burned flesh began to fade, replaced by the odor of decay. Flies gathered in black clouds. The few surviving dogs, half mad with hunger, roamed the ruins in packs. Kim found shelter in the remains of a railway tunnel with a handful of refugees. At night, the wind howled through the openings, carrying with it the distant rumble of artillery to the south, somewhere beyond the mountains. The war still raged, but for Pyongyang, the war had already ended. What remained was not victory or defeat. It was absence. Weeks later, when rain finally came, it turned the ash to mud. The Taedong overflowed, washing away the shallow graves, carrying pieces of what had been a city downstream. Villages miles away would later find fragments of a child's shoe, a scorched photograph, a rusted spoon carried by the current from a place erased. In the quiet that followed, survivors began to rebuild, if only to keep from going mad. They stacked bricks from ruined walls, scavenged metal from bomb casings, and planted small gardens in the blackened soil. Life stubborn, fragile, and uninvited began to take root again among the ruins. But for Kim, the sound of engines in the sky would never fade. Every low hum, every echo of thunder, carried the memory of that night, the night the city stopped breathing. Winter came early to Pyongyang in 1952. The first snow fell on a city that no longer existed, blanketing the rubble like a shroud. From a distance, the devastation looked almost peaceful. White hills where homes once stood. Silence where markets had once shouted. But beneath that fragile layer of purity, the earth was still warm in places, the air still carrying the faint chemical tang of napalm and burned metal. Kim Myong-suk had stopped counting days. Her hair had gone gray at the temples. Her hands, once used to steady surgical instruments, were now cracked and bleeding from lifting stones. She worked with the survivors to clear the debris of what had been the Pyongyang Red Cross Hospital. The basement was intact enough to serve as a shelter, and that was reason enough to rebuild. Every morning, she rose before dawn, her breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. She walked through streets that no longer had names, guided by memory alone. Somewhere beneath each pile of rubble lay a story, a classroom, a family, a photograph half buried in the dust. Each brick she turned over was a reminder of the life she could not save. In the distance, construction cranes appeared, brought in by Soviet engineers and North Korean labor brigades. Trucks rumbled through the ruins, carrying timber and cement. The new Pyongyang would rise not as a restoration, but as an entirely new creation-wide boulevards. Concrete apartments, monuments to resilience. The old city, with its narrow lanes and colonial buildings, would never return. The regime called it revolutionary reconstruction. The people called it starting over with ghosts. At night, Kim sat by a small stove in the basement, surrounded by others who had nowhere else to go. She listened to the wind moaning through broken windows and thought of the boy by the river, the one whose name she never learned. She thought of his small heartbeat, the way it had faded in her arms, and she wondered how many others had disappeared the same way, uncounted, unnamed. The war continued far to the south, but its echo reached every night sky. Each distant explosion, each artillery flash, reminded them that their survival was temporary. Still, they worked. Still, they lived. In February 1953, snowmelt turned the Taedong River gray again. Children began to play among the ruins, running between twisted girders, kicking stones down what had once been tram tracks. For a moment, the sound of laughter returned to Pyongyang. It was fragile, but it was real. One morning, Kim joined a convoy heading toward the city's northern edge, where a temporary clinic had been set up. The road passed through what had been the industrial quarter, a wasteland of melted factories and collapsed chimneys. The skeletal remains of machines jutted from the ground like bones. She recognized the outline of a printing press, its rollers fused together by heat. At the clinic, she met other survivors, nurses, students, even a few soldiers. Together, they cataloged the living and the dead. The list was endless and incomplete. No one truly knew how many had died. Estimates ranged from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. Some were never found at all. In March, the bombings shifted southward. Pyongyang was spared for a time, but the sound of engines never left the people's dreams. At night, many still woke screaming, clawing at the air as if the ceiling were collapsing again. Psychiatrists would later call it collective trauma. The survivors had no such words. They called it the night memory. On clear days, Kim climbed Moranbong Hill, where the city's ruins stretched endlessly below. The horizon shimmered faintly from the heat still radiating from buried fires. She stood there, motionless, the wind tugging at her coat. From that height, she could see where the bomb patterns had carved scars across the land, symmetrical, deliberate, almost beautiful in their precision. It struck her then that the destruction had a design, a geometry of cruelty perfected by distant men who would never walk here, never breathe this air. In July 1953, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed at Panmunjom. There was no celebration in Pyongyang, only exhaustion. The war that had begun as a clash of ideologies ended as an erasure of humanity. When word reached the survivors, they did not cheer. They simply looked up, as if expecting the sky to drop something else upon them. When it didn't, they went back to work. Over the next decade, Pyongyang would be rebuilt from the ground up, a model socialist capital, with wide avenues, concrete towers, and monuments proclaiming eternal resilience. But beneath every foundation, beneath every new brick and statue, the bones of the old city remained silent witnesses to the night it was burned from history. Kim Myong-suk never left. She worked as a nurse until the 1970s, treating a new generation that grew up, never knowing what had been lost. Sometimes Medin Sao, when she walked home past the new Taedong embankment, she would stop by the river, watching the reflection of street lights shimmer where once the fires had danced. To others, it was progress. To her, it was remembrance. By the early 1960s, Pyongyang no longer resembled the scarred wasteland it once was. The city had become a symbol of survival, of ideology, of rebirth forced through unimaginable loss. Wide boulevards cut through the landscape where alleyways and markets had once crowded. Granite statues now stood where children once played. Their eyes turned skyward toward ideals carved in stone. To visitors, it looked like triumph. But to those who had lived through 1952, every street carried ghosts. Kim Myong-suk walked through the new city each morning on her way to the hospital, now a gleaming complex of glass and white tile, built with Soviet aid. Patients lined the corridors. Young soldiers returning from the demilitarized zone. Mothers holding infants stillborn from malnutrition. Miners coughing from the coal dust of the country's rapid reconstruction. She treated them all the same, calm, methodical, her hands steady, but her eyes distant. Her colleagues spoke of the future with rehearsed confidence, how Pyongyang would become the model of the new Korea, how the city's destruction had been the necessary sacrifice for the birth of socialism. Kim never argued. She had no strength left for ideology. The word rebirth to her meant something quieter, something smaller, one breath continuing after another. On her lunch breaks, she often sat near the Taedong River, the same river that had once burned. Its waters now flowed clear, bordered by concrete embankments and willow trees planted in perfect rows. Children fed pigeons near the steps. A brass band practiced in the distance. No one spoke of what had happened beneath those waters, of the countless bones still resting in the silt, of the small jacket she had used to bury a nameless boy 11 years before. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the north, she swore she could still smell smoke, faint, sweet, and impossible. In her final years, Kim began keeping a diary. She wrote not of politics or war, but of fragments, the color of the river at sunset, the sound of a train whistle at dawn, the shape of a cloud that reminded her of a burning wing. She never mentioned the bombings by name. Perhaps she no longer needed to. Perhaps the silence was the only language left that could contain the truth. She died in the winter of 1974 at 63. Her grave overlooked the Taedong. There was no headstone, only a small wooden marker that read, Nurse, 1950-1953. But the story did not end with her. For decades, Pyongyang's official history spoke of imperialist destruction and heroic reconstruction, but the details, the exact number of bombs, the names of the victims, the testimonies of survivors remained locked away, classified as strategic memory. Western archives told a different story, operational data from the U.S. Air Force confirmed that by the end of the war, approximately 75% of all bombs dropped in the Korean peninsula had targeted the north. Over 18 of 22 major cities were completely destroyed. Pyongyang had been reduced to rubble not once, but 6 times between 1950 and 1953. General Emmett O'Donnell, commanding the Far East Air Force's Bomber Command, testified to Congress in 1951, "We have bombed every means of communication, every installation, factory, village, and town in North Korea now. Nothing is standing worthy of the name." By conservative estimates, nearly 12 to 15% of North Korea's population perished, more than 1.2 million civilians. For comparison, that is a higher proportional death toll than the Soviet Union suffered during World War II's most devastated regions. And yet, few outside the Korean peninsula ever learned what truly happened to Pyongyang. No photographs of the burning city circulated in Western media. No documentaries captured the faces of the children who vanished in the fire. The silence was deliberate, a blank space in global memory where an entire city had once stood. Even today, satellite images show Pyongyang's rigid symmetry, its avenues and monuments laid out in patterns of control and pride. But beneath the concrete, the soil still remembers. Farmers near the outskirts still uncover fragments of melted glass and shrapnel when they till the earth. In spring, when the rains come, the river still brings up bones. The past is not gone. It breathes through the cracks of every rebuilt wall, every song written about resilience, every silence maintained in classrooms. And maybe that is what Kim Myung-suk understood long before historians would, that no matter how bright the city's lights shone, beneath them, the ghosts of 1952 still walked unseen, unacknowledged, waiting for someone to remember. Between 1950 and 1953, the Korean War claimed an estimated 3 million lives, most of them civilian. U.S. aerial campaigns dropped 635,000 tons of bombs and 557 tons of napalm across North Korea, the equivalent of one Hiroshima every week for 3 years. Pyongyang, the capital, was destroyed by over 75 air raids. Its population reduced from $500,000 to fewer than $50,000 by mid-1952. The city that exists today is not a continuation. It is a reconstruction layered atop graves, ash, and silence. For the survivors, memory became both a wound and a duty. Their voices, once buried, are only now emerging in scattered testimonies, fading photographs, and forbidden letters. Each one tells the same truth, that no ideology, no flag, no justification can restore what was burned away in those 47 minutes when the sky above Pyongyang turned to fire. And so the question remains one that history still struggles to answer. Who remembers the city that vanished overnight? What are your thoughts on the destruction of Pyongyang, a tragedy that has remained hidden from the world's conscience for more than 70 years? Let us know in the comments below.